Welcome back to another episode of BCentrico in Conversation, a content series that explores the intersections of sustainability, social impact, and storytelling. I'm Caroline Asiala, the CEO of BCentrico, and we're joined today by an incredible change maker and all-around human being, Mark Horoszowski. He is the CEO and co-founder of MovingWorlds, a leading force in the movement to sustainability and social enterprise. And we're here to talk today about his journey in impact-driven work and his vision for the future of business. I'm really excited about this conversation, so let's get into it. This is BCentrico in Conversation. Welcome to BCentrico in Conversation, Mark. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Caroline. I'm really excited for it.
Yeah. So your personal story is really interesting. You've been involved in a lot of different industries. You started out earlier on in your career doing marketing at an agency, and that means that you were a storyteller, and then you brought that expertise into social enterprise. Can you talk to us a little bit more about your story and how you got into social impact work?
Yeah, and I think my experience in marketing, which at the time was embedded in the healthcare industry, kind of ended up being the catalyst, if you will, that launched me there, right? But I think even before that, also had two really formative experiences for me that really helped me think about and start that exploration of, hey, how do I use my career? And ultimately, when I got to the entrepreneurial level, my organization to really contribute to social good, right? And the first one was something that started for me before I even remember, right? Which was volunteering and just community engagement, right? I have two parents that immigrated from Eastern Europe. And, when they came without community, they found community. In large part, they helped develop community. From there, was involved in volunteering, Boy Scouts, and then the American Cancer Society. There's so many quotes that talk about the importance of community and that local impact, right? And so that was a big part of really, I think, who I was as a person when I entered the professional workplace. Now, the second thing is I actually graduated with 2 degrees in accounting. So my very first part of my experience was in accounting, and I was also the first person from my graduating class to not stay in accounting, but I actually still really attribute that experience around using data and really sound processes to scale up an organization as being critical. But what I ultimately saw there too was, as somebody who is engaged in auditing of financial institutions, just this focus on money and quality of money and speed to report how much money you're making. And it was totally opposite to all that community driven aspect of really a lot of who I was as a person. And so I then ended up moving into marketing for this healthcare agency, as I thought maybe this is the place where I can combine this kind of business, the power of business, right? Which have always seen as just being this immense force on earth. But with something that was obviously, from my experience with the American Cancer Society on a cause that was much closer to me. And I think having also that kind of like data, like operational background was really useful for me as I got involved in marketing. This was the start of digital marketing, right? I think you'll probably find humor in this. Like, this is when you could still make a Facebook page, but only as a person. So we were like making brands people on Facebook, right? Like, like very early on. And then using data and just walking into meetings that really I had no business being in, given my age and experience, but had data, had this kind of digital, nativeness, if you will. I don't think my generation's digital native, but at least at the time we were as close as they come. And so as a result, I really got exposed to a lot of really great business building opportunities early on. But then when the Great Recession hit, you know, we made it through. That was, well, second maybe to the recession and you know, COVID crisis that we all just experienced, right? That was the hardest, you know, had ever worked, was incredibly draining. And when we came out of it, the owner of the healthcare agency really wanted us to just sell out the digital strategy group. And it was part of a retirement plan for him, which of course I could understand, but that wasn't what I wanted. And I spent trying to advocate for us to do more to support the nonprofit industry. Profits were not there. And so I was really intrigued and was like, you know, there's got to be a better way to kind of merge these models, right? Where you don't get into these points where just because one person decides to go pursue profit above all else, that others can't live into their purpose. And that's what really led me to the power of social business. And it was around the same time that B Corp was just starting, that Eunice had written his book, Social Business. And so that kind of led me to explore and say, hey, how can I use my time here to really support this movement? So
that's really interesting that you have a background in accounting. I didn't know that. That's fascinating to me because one of the biggest trends in jobs in the social sector right now is impact investing and accounting for the triple bottom line. And so that's really fascinating because I think traditionally we don't think about people who go into accounting wanting to work in the social impact sector. And now it's becoming more and more evident that that's really necessary and really needed.
Yeah, it's massive. And I think, you know, you see it, right? You mentioned impact investing, right? This big emphasis on ESG, environmental, social, and governance. And I think it was PwC, right? International consultancy already employs a couple 100,000 people, saying that a lot of their new job creation is going to be specifically in ESG categories, right? And this is accounting not just for money, but for our environmental footprint, for social inequities. It's an astute observation and something that it's kind of funny how some things do definitely kind of start to come back full circle a little bit.
Absolutely. And I think it's just a proof that you can study anything. I mean, you can be interested in anything at all and work that into the social impact space.
I mean, I think more and more we see in social impact that we're really tackling systemic problems, right? Like the patches just aren't working. And when you get into systems, you get into organizations, you get into networks, you get into human psyche and, you know, behavioral psychology, you get into all these aspects. And if we don't have all kind of modes of thinking and all types of professions and skills at the table, like, we're really not going to be able to make sustainable change.
Absolutely. And that's become more and more evident to me in our work at BCentrico, working with social enterprise and nonprofits. We have clients all over the place in all kinds of different industries, in tech, in counseling, in pretty much everywhere that you can think of, that there are social enterprises popping up and nonprofits popping up to address issues in those industries. And that kind of brings me to another question for you. You have talked publicly a lot about the social enterprise movement. Can you explain what is that? What is the social enterprise movement and what is your vision for it?
We have this presentation that we gave to the World Economic Forum earlier this year, based on some research that we did, really exploring the social enterprise movement and corporate involvement and investments in it. And one of my favorite slides in this presentation is a Giphy. If you've ever seen it, there's like this panda that's like sitting in a chair and it's kind of like face palming and it like kind of rolls out of the chair. And we use that to describe and just show like social enterprise means a lot of things to different people. And as we went through our research and we asked that question, we heard all kinds of different examples. And for us, what we really kind of picked up on, and there's some research from the Social Enterprise World Forum that collaborated with a lot of different entities to say, this is what a social enterprise is. And it's really close to what we also teach in our MovingWorlds Institute, right? Which is, an entity legally created to create social good. It uses the power of the market, so in its day-to-day business operations, to deliver that social good. Not like a buy one, give one model, but like a direct intervention where when people pay for it, it creates social and environmental good. The profits, so as you generate revenue, it's invested back into the growth for the sake of creating impact. There aren't like institutional investors in the entity, right? It's really owned. Well, there can be impact investors in the entity, but most of the equity is also owned by either the workers themselves or the key beneficiaries of it. And there's a long-term component here. So if it's ever bought, the mission is actually protected as it grows. So when I talk about social enterprise, that's what we talk about. This is a social good organization with highly ethical internal operations that are also transparent, and it exists for long-term benefit, and it pushes on the greater system around it to become better. The EU commissioned a report that a third of new startups and of new businesses this year exist for some type of social good or higher purpose, right?
Wow.
Now, not all of them are incorporated as a social enterprise or benefit corporation, which is the common legal designation for these. However, there are groups that have, in their kind of founding, purpose statements, have said, "Hey, we really are here for something more than just to create money." And there's a lot of factors going into that, right? There's just the individual desires that we all have, right, to be a part of something bigger than ourselves. When we buy products, we want to know that we're not contributing to so many of the social and environmental inequities and catastrophes that we're seeing. It seems like every day. I'm based in Seattle right now. It's a smoke-filled day with some of the worst air quality in the world right now because of climate change. And so I think we see this, and we want to both work and buy from these entities, and people see that then as a market opportunity, right? And on the other side, we're seeing companies, their employees are, and I know Centrico, supports and works with net impact. I mean, there's a net impact study from, I think, 2012 that says, a decade ago, people were willing to take salary pay cuts to work at companies that aligned with their values. And that's only continuing. And so big corporations are under pressure from an employee standpoint. They're under pressure from an investment standpoint. If they want to access capital to grow, more and more money is being earmarked as saying, we can invest in you, but only if you're reporting on your ESG criteria. So carbon footprint, pay and equity within your company, governance structures. And part of the reason institutional investors are now caring for that is because governments are also caring for that, right? They're saying, hey, if you want to be able to still do business across these things, we need to see these reports. We need to understand how capital is being used and what it's funding. And so overall, these moves towards transparency, these moves towards more ethical business models. Now with benefit corporation, right? I know you're also in a benefit corporation, right? As that rating system and legal entity enters into more and more areas, people now realize that they have a choice both on where they work, what type of business they start. And I think that's really fueling that growth, right? That 1/3 of new businesses, right? And the question is hey, 1/3 is awesome. How do we get to 2/3, right? How do we get to 100%, right? And I think that's where we're moving.
And what are some of the most common misconceptions people have about social enterprise?
Yeah, it's a good question. Depends who you ask. I think so. I'll go back to the research that we were talking about. In our research, we interviewed a few board members of publicly traded companies. Right. The misconception there is that social enterprise equals philanthropy. Right. We were blown away by the lack of strategy at very senior levels. In corporate leaders, both senior execs and chief level executives, as well as board members, who were viewing the move towards regenerative business models, circular economy, more sustainable ESG investments as costs, and not as this is actually a future driver for our business, right? And And I worry for those companies, right? They are going to lose employees. They're gonna get outpaced from an innovation standpoint. So I think that's one of the really big misconceptions, right? I think, on the totally opposite side of that spectrum is the new social entrepreneur who thinks that they have some really good intervention that solves a problem, but it has no business model. And so they're on the other side saying, oh, but this is for social good. And so it'll work. we'll find a way for it to work. And those models won't work. The definition of social enterprise that it's using the power of the market. And so it is kind of funny to have these like two people on very, very different sides of the financial power system and structure, kind of look at it and have such, in a way, similar, right? Yes, this is for good, but also just like such different kind of views, right? Where one is like, oh, there's no way it can have a business model. And the other one almost saying like, oh, but it's just for good. So it doesn't need one, right? I think, or it's
inevitable. Like the business model is inevitable because this is just such a great impact that we're making that it'll just work out.
Exactly. Says every entrepreneur ever, right? Yes, don't worry about it. It'll work out. Yeah. The other thing that we found in our research and why we're very motivated there is all impact investing assets under management. There's actually a brand new report on this. So this is different from the presentation I was giving a couple months ago on that topic. All impact investing assets under management is around $2 trillion in the world right now. Of that, 500 million is actively measured in accordance with the IFC's impact investing principles, right? So all impact investing assets, not waiting to be deployed, but also currently deployed, 500 million. That's a lot of money, right? I'm sorry, not 500 million, 500 billion with a B, 500 billion. A huge amount of money. That number is around 3 to 4x bigger than all government spending on development aid, right? So,
wow.
So impact investing, huge asset. Now, every year, small businesses, as part of other business-to-business transactions, are transacting $12 trillion every year, right? So way more money is spent just in business-to-business transactions with entities that social enterprises are typically around that size. So we're here saying, like, for sure, if you're trying to grow as a social enterprise, trying to raise some impact investment money is a good idea. But if you really want to grow, you have to figure out how to, tap into that $12 trillion market opportunity.
Totally.
And so that's really where MovingWorlds is focused right now, to say most social enterprises won't actually raise the amount of impact capital that they dream of raising, but they can absolutely access partnership and revenue-based capital by delivering value. And we think there's a lot of potential for social enterprises to grow and create impact in that method.
That's awesome. And I think we'll share those reports in the description of the video too, so that everyone can have access to those, because those numbers are really powerful, I think. MovingWorlds takes an approach that's really different from a lot of the hype around impact investing. There's especially a lot of talk about impact investing. Yes, that part is important, and it addresses the financial opportunities that social enterprises have to grow. But what MovingWorlds is really focused on is the human aspect of those organizations, and the human aspect of who in the world is supporting them from the corporate side, who in the world is supporting them from on the inside. Can you talk a little bit about why you chose to make MovingWorlds focus the human talent behind social enterprise?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of factors, right? Like, one is like, ultimately, people are the ones that are making decisions right on the day-to-day, right? And so it just felt like we can't talk about systems, we can't talk about capitalism, we can't talk about a circular economy if we don't talk about the people working to do that, being motivated to achieve that, right? So that was one. Like, there's all this talk about, big data, data is the new oil, and like all, and yes, but there are people, individuals making decisions to do that, right? And so we said, we can't wait and only look at the kind of aggregation of people's efforts. We really want to get on the human side. I think the other piece is, it was the unaddressed issue, right? Is there's a great report from, I want to say it's 2014, called the Pioneer Gap, and it was Stanford Social Innovation Review along with Acumen, and I'm sorry, there's another organization that I don't recall that was an author on the paper as well. And what they argue is that when you have an idea, it's easy to raise money, and when you're scaling, it's easy to raise money. But once you're in this kind of first interaction of your idea, with potential customers and in the market, you start to realize, ooh, my value prop's a little wrong. Oof, I have to invest more in customer service than I thought. Oh, some of those features that I needed weren't built into my model, and I wasted money building some other things I didn't need. That's it's a really scary time for organizations. It's also called the startup valley of death, right? And it's about where, roughly 50% of enterprises will fail. So the Pioneer Gap, the startup valley of death. There's another great comic. It calls it like just the pit of despair or the valley of despair or something like this. It's very in a dark place.
Really depressing kind of metaphors for this situation.
But to talk to a social entrepreneur, any entrepreneur, they understand that moment and they go, that's where I didn't have access to anything, right? People didn't want to give me money because the only thing I could share was that we were falling short of projections, right? I couldn't get a loan because we were already indebted. I couldn't attract employees because we weren't at this like exciting stage of growth. So what happens is we fund enterprises at the idea stage, right? And then we let them be. We just say, good luck crossing the pit of despair, the valley of death, the Pioneer Gap, whatever it is, good luck. And then as soon as your economics start to work out, then there's a lot of investors that will invest in you. But for us, we said, we're investing in building up social enterprises, and then we just leave them alone in this pit of despair. And money won't go there, so who will? People can. And if people can get there, and people can go and they can volunteer their expertise, or they can help make connections, or they can serve as a network or a mentor, they can help provide training, a few important things happen. One is the organizations that receive this support from other humans now have other connections, right, which will help them in the future for sales, recruitment, et cetera. Another thing is the people working in this social enterprise also start to develop their own skills, right? And so, yeah, their idea might still fail, but if it does, they've also had the opportunity to learn from experts from around the world in ways that will upskill them, right? So whatever they choose to do next, they're going to have more connections, they're going to have more capabilities, right? And then I think the third piece that happens is the professionals that go and support these social enterprises, when they return to whatever they're doing next, which is their own venture or maybe a big company that employs them or potentially even sponsored them, these employees then say, wow, there's a different way to operate that's more lean, that's more innovative, that's more community focused. And can I bring that thinking back in my company? In fact, maybe I can even partner with some of these social enterprises that are stuck in that area. So that's the MovingWorlds approach. Like the reason we wanted to invest in humans is to say, A, there's a lot of humans stuck in this pioneer gap, right? And let's not give up on these organizations, right? It's a hard place to be. And we think we can do a lot more to support them. And then secondly, it's a much longer term actually investment because people on both sides of this interaction will continue to grow their own organizations and initiatives to be more socially responsible. And, I think from our side, we just said, that also sounds like an interesting challenge, right? Like impact investing's already been figured out. It has a lot of improvement areas, there's lots of growth. Like there's a lot going on there, right? Nobody's going to support this area because the economics don't work. But if we're going to preach this kind of social enterprise business model, let's prove that the economics can work. And that's has not been an easy task, but we are growing and we are growing on revenue. So we're cracking the nut on this more and more every year.
That's awesome. And if it were easy, everybody would be doing it, right? And it wouldn't be a problem. And you probably wouldn't need to exist, but thank God you do. And in MovingWorlds, you send professionals out to support these social enterprises. How do you make sure that you help them not play into the kind of savior complex that people can have when they're going, because that misconception of social enterprise is charity. Okay, I'm going to go and I'm going to help and I'm going to be so helpful and I'm going to save them. How do you avoid that kind of trope?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think for us, we started the social enterprises and we work backwards, right? And I think, if you go to a social enterprise and you're like, hey, here's 10 people, and like they each want to give you $1,000 to like do something. You're like, oh, okay, I guess I could get paid $10,000 or something and like make up some things for these people to do. And like, right. And so we don't do that, right? We go to the social enterprise and we say, what are you working on? What's your biggest challenge? Where do you need help? Right. And what they will say is like, I don't need any help. I need a connection to this company, or, I do need a little bit. I have this awesome engineer, but he's pretty young and hasn't worked at this level of scale before. Can you help find someone who could train him as we kind of get from 1 million to 10 million users? Or, hey, we've got a brand new marketing team. We're trying to figure out where we kind of focus and grow. Could you help us figure out, that strategy for us? So we start with social enterprises, and then once we have their needs, we then ask them and what can you provide, right? And pre-COVID, it was a place to stay. During COVID, of course, it's all been virtual. Even pre-COVID, there were virtual engagements as well. But I think what we see is social enterprises are like, oh yeah, and I can offer this, or I can offer insight, or you can kind of get this crash course in what it's like to try and raise money as a social enterprise, network with impact investing organizations. And so in a way, they're kind of saying like, hey, I need help with this, but this is also what I have to give, right? And then when we go to professionals then get to see these projects, right? And they get to see, oh, that's like a direct, a skills match for me, right? And then what we do, even in the way that we recruit professionals, is with this model of like create change, be change, right? Like you're going to create an impact, but you're going to be impacted in return. And so you need to be ready for that. So we also provide them some training, some guidance. There's like a manifesto that speaks to these core concepts. And in our MovingWorlds Institute program, we actually have a 6-month fellowship, application-only community where professionals kind of who are looking to grow their careers in social impact are engaging in this experience, but very much to also invest in their own growth and self. And so as a result of that, and as part of that, I think they're really looking at this as a way to say, I'm here to learn, I'm here to grow. And it really takes that power dynamic out of it. So, maybe the short answer there is it's how we've, kind of designed the process. It's how we market, communicate. It's also how we support every individual match.
And how you recruit too, right? Like when you're not looking for someone, when someone applies to the MovingWorlds Institute, you're not looking for someone to say, I want to go to save the poor people.
That's right.
No.
That's right.
I want to learn. I want to change. I want to invigorate my career with a new experience. And you kind of look for people with that humility already built in.
That's exactly right.
Absolutely. Really important. And as opposed to other programs that do sometimes volunteering, I think that's a really important distinction, that it's you're going because you have this skill set and you can help in this very specific way, and here are all the ways that you're going to be changed by this experience and you're going to learn more than anything. So I think that's a really important distinction. There's a lot of programs out there that you can go if you want to get into nonprofit work, that you can go and volunteer, but not a lot of programs that will actually, one, use your own professional expertise that you already have, and to have you matched in such a way that you are going to have a really authentic, good experience.
Imagine being in an interview and somebody asking like, how do you know that you can join our impact investing firm and help manage deal flow, right? And you can say like, oh, I went with 10 people to a place and like saw poverty firsthand. Like that, it's not going to help you, right? Or like, hey, I took a course, right? Here's a certificate, not going to help you. But if you can say, because I've been boots on the ground, right? I spent 3 months with the social enterprise. I helped them refine their business model. I helped them pitch to 10 different funds, right? And then this is what we learned. And this was the output of that work, right? If you've lived that experience being with these social enterprises, right? Or some of our people have actually gone to expert tier with impact investing funds as well, right? Like, to be able to then include that, that means you've done it. I think that's the whole kind of create change, be changed idea, right? It's like you could go create immediate impact, but then you can use this to advance yourself, and that levels the power dynamics, right? And it really creates it like, hey, me as the expert tier and my partner, the social enterprise, like we're working together both to grow, and it just creates really, really cool like stories and experiences and connections right across borders.
Absolutely. Taking a look into what kinds of people you recruit for this fellowship and the social entrepreneurs that you support, they all have this idea that they want to use their career for good. But for someone who doesn't necessarily have a clear idea of how to do that, where is a good place to start?
Our first advice to people is always like, then write that goal down, right? I want to make change, and tell a friend about it. Like, first thing you can do out of the gate, write a goal down and get an accountability buddy to actually achieving it, right? The first thing is just take a first step. Yep, just take a first step. Okay, now from there's a lot of things that you can do. And I think if you're like, I don't think I'm ready to leave my job. Like, if you don't have that fire burning that has you like, I'm looking to leave, my job, then don't put that pressure on you. Way too stressful a decision. Just say, you know what? I'm going to start by figuring out if I can do this at my current company, right? Now, down the road, you might realize that you can't, but you've taken the steps. Now you've learned more, and then you might be ready. So the question then becomes is, if you're ready to go leave your job, that's one path. If you're not, then figure out within your company. There's a lot of guides, and MovingWorlds has contributed to a few of these as well, of like social entrepreneurship, right? Which we think is actually a little too audacious. It's funny, we use the term, but we don't love it because most of us aren't entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, right? And it's kind of scary to get that label, right? You don't want that, right? Companies don't hire intrapreneurs, right? They hire really effective professionals to keep growing kind of in a specific way. So, but I think there's some thinking that embodies this kind of entrepreneurship idea that is very applicable. So if in doubt, you can kind of look for some entrepreneurship resources. But honestly, it just starts with analysis of what you have control over, right? We were giving a workshop at a very large online retail company, based in Seattle. And in one of the workshops, what came out of it is that this person that was responsible for millions in ad spend wasn't doing enough diligence to see where their ad money was actually going. And when they did that, they realized that some of their ad spend was actually on far right and far left propaganda websites during the election, right?
Wow.
And they just hadn't thought about it, right? They were using the same paid networks that a lot of other people use, right? And then, in the afternoon, they were advocating, to get Parler off, Amazon Web Services, right? And it was like, they were funding the very, unknowingly, right? They were funding the initiatives that they were then trying to advocate against. And so the first thing is just to really understand, like, are you doing anything that might actually be contributing to problems, right? Now that's if you have budget, right? And then similarly, if you do have budget, where can you spend that budget in a way that's more constructive? So that's kind of where you start. I think the next phase of that is then to say, okay, then who maybe do I have influence over? So if you're a manager, that's a little bit more obvious. If you're an individual contributor, right, that's a little bit different. But you can look at who are these different groups. And similarly, where might you be creating harm? And also, what assets do you have that maybe could be creating some good? And we recommend a framework called systems mapping, where you can just kind of draw on a map and say, who do I influence and connect with and touch with? And what assets do they have? And what inequities might they be contributing to? And do I have any influence or ability to connect into that and maybe help make an impact? So that for us is really like, just start, right? And we think those are kind of the easiest ways to get started. And, of course, you're right. I'd be remiss to not make a plug for the MovingWorlds Institute, right, which tries to build even more structure into this program. But what we see in having supported over 350 fellows in this experience is just having some like camaraderie, right, as you go through this exploration. So you're not alone. You're not trying to work on this like in isolate. I think it's just super powerful, right? And to just keep asking questions and from here, I think it's very much personality driven. Like if you're already a learner, then go learn, right? But if you're a doer, just go do it, right? Just start volunteering, but be strategic with what you learn and what you volunteer with, right? If you're really trying to position your career for impact, start to volunteer with organizations that are part of your career story, right? That aren't just like totally disconnected from your future. Same, if you're just learning, right? Try and learn more about the space that you're going to.
I think that's really interesting, the community aspect of that, because I see that as a pattern in a lot of these programs that from our clients, net impact, huge community of change makers across the world. And yes, it's about you making a difference, but it's also about you introspecting and having the community around you to help you introspect and understand where your role is. The same with Uplifting Impact, another client of ours, Deanna Singh. She's created this whole community and universe around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the first thing that she says when you're starting in diversity and equity inclusion work is introspection, is think about what are the places where you might be creating harm, first of all, and dealing with that, acknowledging that, working on that. And then you can start to help other people see those things and other people change and create change. But the first part is introspection. Where might you be yourself or your activities unknowingly creating harm? And not in a way to guilt trip you, but in a way to understand and have empathy for other people who also may be making these sort of, in diversity, equity, inclusion space, microaggressions, in, the sustainability place. Are there microaggressions against the climate and against the earth? Maybe. And so recognizing that and starting with yourself and then branching out. It's not just about, I want to make the biggest change on the world. It's, I want my life and my career to be impactful.
It's such I'm really glad that you highlighted that. Cole Hoover, who leads our institute, has kind of developed this like framework that we call social enterprise thinking, right? And it starts with understanding self. And there's different tools, to help you do that: assessments, reflection exercises, et cetera. And then from there, it goes into like systems mapping, and then using concepts like human-centered design and others. But to carry that weave of what is your personal purpose and desire for carrying through all this work, and just like putting a label on it, right? Discussing it with a friend, a colleague, or a mentor is super important. And we see it. We run these different case studies in the Institute where at the end, we then ask the question of like, hey, how did your purpose pattern or how did your strengths influence how you engaged with this community or engaged with this problem? And you immediately see people go, oh yeah, that totally changes how I approach a problem. As an example, if you've done like, let's say Gallup Strengths Finder, right? There's some skills that are like very strategic. So anybody who is heavily weighted in strategy work, as soon as they're presented with a problem, they're going to just turn to their strengths, which is strategy. Whereas others are maybe really high on relationship building strengths. So their first impulse is always start building connections with the people, right? And others who are really heavily weighted in execution are like, well, we got to do. And so to just know who you are, both in how you work, but then also what is your like personal motivation, does change the way that you actually support other initiatives. And it's really important to label and just be aware of. Say like, hey, when I'm in that situation, that is how I will show up, right? And to be able to check that and say, is that right? And sometimes it is right, but sometimes it might need to be complemented by other things too. So being able to understand and have that awareness of self is super important. I'm really, really glad you highlighted that.
Right. And I also really appreciate what you said about quitting your job is not the only way to make an impact with your career. Like, I think that there's a lot of, in the impact space, there's a lot of sort of privilege built into the way that that gets talked about of, well, if you don't agree with the company, that your company's values, and you're working for this big greedy corporation, why don't you just quit your job? And that speaks to a very, very small percentage of people who could, in this world, that could just quit their job and everything would be fine. And so that's not the answer for most people, I would say.
Agreed.
And being able to first introspect and say, okay, how is my work? How could I change my work at my current place? Who can I influence within my business? And then what are the things that I can do to build my skills and build my knowledge so that I am prepared once I do want to leave my current job? And that's interesting because I think there's a lot of pressure on my generation, meaning the tail end of millennials, but really a lot of people across a lot of different generations. I think it's probably the strongest it's ever been with millennials is to want to not, you don't want to have your impact and volunteer work and then your job, and they're two separate things. It's like we kind of want to have those things align and have their career be the main way that they create impact. But then that also creates a lot of pressure on people to have the perfect career. And if they're not aligned, then you're a terrible person. No. But what are the ways that you can maybe improve that? So can you talk about that? Have you come into contact with that pressure that people feel that their company isn't perfect, their job isn't perfect, and it's not perfectly aligning with a sustainable and just world?
Yeah. There's a story on our blog from someone that is now working on sustainability at Amazon. And, when we were having conversations, when she was going through the Institute, she was looking at it and she was leaning like very heavily towards the ESG space, right? But maybe on the impact investing side or maybe on the social enterprise. But she had all this awesome corporate experience. And we're like, think about the lever at your disposal, right? There's a quote that we use at MovingWorlds a lot, which you'll see the connection to our very name. So it's an Archimedes quote, right? Give me a lever long enough, a place on where I can place it and I can move the world. And so we talk about levers, and we talk about like some corporate entities are massive levers, right? And in this specific case, right, this fellow was like thinking about joining this company after she'd kind of gotten this recruitment and then ultimately a job opportunity, and saying like, I just don't know if I can, right? I don't know if I can go join this company. You can almost hear this fear of like judgment from colleagues, from friends of like, hey, you exist for sustainability, but you're going to go work for that company, right? And the question is like, but can I make it better, right? And can I help mitigate the harms? And can I actually help use it as a force for good? And can I use this as an opportunity? And the answer is like, in all cases, maybe not, but in some, yes. And so embark on that experience, not as a determinant for the rest of your life, but as a learning experience, right? To say, hey, whatever you do next or wherever you are, your job is not to be perfect. Your job is to learn. And I think that framing is really important as we think about wherever you're working, you have a lever at your disposal, right? Now, it might not be one of the world's biggest companies and specifically like their sustainability or the operations division, but it might be something. It might be how you direct ad spend. It might be how you help implant more equitable hiring practices, right? It might be how you help increase transparency for the way you select partners or vendors. So there's a lot of small things that can be done, and what we just see time and time again is the challenges to start. And actually, there's I was listening to another podcast, and it was a performance psychologist who works with the most hyper elite athletes and performers in the world. His name's Michael Gervais. The podcast is called Finding Mastery. He was talking to an athlete and saying like, hey, give a tip to the listener. It's like, for people that are trying to get a little bit healthier, they're trying to go to the gym, what's your advice? And the questions got more precise. They said, what's the hardest part about going to the gym, right? And then if you can only do one exercise, what do you do? And the answers from this athlete were, the hardest part is opening the door, right? And the most important one is the one exercise you should do is the one that you have fun doing. And it's the exact same idea, right? It's like to think about this like really long workout I have to do, or like how much time I'm going to be on the treadmill, or I'm like, I haven't done it in a couple, my knees are going to creak, whatever it is. Like, but I can open the door, right? Like, and to just set that bar, right? And like, I just need to go in there and I'm gonna just go have fun. Because once you're in there, okay, then you might see some weights, right? Then you might see like, so you'll do a little bit more. The hard part's just starting. And I think that's what we, I guess maybe my guidance would be related to this question. It's like, wherever you are, you have a lever at your disposal. And it might be a small one relative to others, but it's what you have now, and just start, right? And once you kind of pull on that, that's just going to keep opening up doors.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that I always try to keep in mind is that I do want my profession to contribute to good, but I also never want to conflate my professional success with my value as a human being. Because if one of my values, and part of what needs to align with my career, is that every human being has inherent worth, then I need to give that to myself too.
Yeah, that's cool.
And you have to be as generous with yourself as you are with what you want for society, and what you want for the earth, and what you want for your organization, right?
Yeah, that resonates deeply. I love that addition here.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to get into a couple of rapid fire questions that we're doing with every guest. So given all of the grief and the challenges and the inequities and division in our world today, what is something that gives you hope?
I'm reading a book right now called Better Humans. We are I don't know if this is a story that will resonate with a lot, but the story of like the civilization collapse on Easter Island. Turns out it's not true, right? The civilization collapse was not because the island like went to war with each other, right? That's a fairy tale, right? And so this author looks at all these different stories that we have been kind of, I think, raised on and told about how we will devolve to violence. That is not true, right? I think humans actually devolve to looking out for each other, and that book and these stories, they give me hope. Our natural inclination is to care for each other, to be social beings, to learn from each other. And so core to us as people is to support each other, and that gives me hope.
That's so interesting that you say that, because I was just talking to one of the MovingWorlds Institute fellows, and she said, I asked her, what are you most concerned about in the post-pandemic or new reality during pandemic? Because honestly, most of the world is still in a pandemic. And she said, my biggest worry is that we won't come together, and that we won't form communities, and that we won't do these things. And then I asked her, well, what gives you hope about it? And she said, but I think we will. I think we will come together. I think we will do these things. So I love that. I love that you said that. And it reflects a lot of the kind of people that you attract to your program and to your brand. That's awesome. And alongside of that, when people are working in sustainability issues, social impact issues, it can get really frustrating sometimes, because you can have that long-term vision of, yes, we're going to come together. Yes, we're going to build community, but it's not always happening in the moment. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that not getting to a place where you're burned out because you feel like the systems are never changing quick enough? How do you deal with those feelings?
Yeah. Earlier you kind of mentioned your own, like some of your own personal values, right? And I think, kind of coming with like an understanding of self and just kind of being open and honest with myself of like, what do I believe about, my reason for being on planet Earth, right? What does success look like for me in the long term, right? Any elder who's ever kind of given kind of wisdom, right? They always say like, think about things on like a longer time frame, right? Like, do things that you like, try and live without regrets, right? Some of these things, but I think that just stretching some of these things out and then saying, okay, what is my contribution? And then looking historically and saying, what have others done, right? And how do we measure their success, right? And once you start to look at that, you say like, yep, we probably won't solve all of capitalism's and democracy's shortcomings in my generation, right? But that doesn't mean that our contributions aren't important to that, right? And if you think about the historical figures that look at on and for inspiration, I very consistently look at Florence Nightingale, who I think is kind of one of the first social entrepreneurs, and to say her impact on the nursing industry and public policy and social workers. She's passed a long time ago, and these industries aren't perfect today, but they're better, right? And so I think for me, what kind of just gives me energy is to kind of just set my expectations to be a little bit more realistic, right? And then to say like, these contributions matter, but I'm one of a lot of people that are going to be very important for moving these things forward. And just to be like very, very good with that. So that's given me a lot of strength, I think, especially during the last, 18 months, to just say like, look, we aren't going to solve all these challenges like in the next decade, right? But we are going to be a part of this really long kind of important story of creating systems that are more equitable and sustainable.
And stories, I think, is a lot of how that happens, because we talked at the beginning about kind of some of the stories that we tell ourselves or that other people are telling themselves about social impact, sustainability, social enterprise. How do you think we can tell the story of social enterprise better?
Such a good question. Oh, I just don't, I thought about this question, and, the easiest way that like when in doubt, right? Feynman has this quote, like, or this way of thinking that says, if I can't explain it to a fifth grader, right? Or maybe it's a 5-year-old, I can't remember. I think it's a 5-year-old, like a kindergartner, right? Then I don't understand it, right? So
yeah, because fifth graders are pretty advanced.
They start to get savvy, right? It's the kindergartners, right? And so it's like, okay, is there a way to kind of describe this, right, to a kindergartner in a way that like really makes sense, right? And that's not easy. Like, I don't think I've nailed that, right? But I always go to like the idea of like food sharing, right? Because like, especially candy sharing, like kids love cookies, right? So it's like the idea of like business, right, is like, if you're one kid, you're going to go get cookies from everybody. You're going to be super happy, right, with all your cookies at first. And you're going to sit there with all your cookies, but you're going to start eating and you're going to get a stomach ache, right? And then you're going to look around the room and you're going to see all these kids are going to be unhappy, right? Because they don't have their cookies. And then they're not going to play with you tomorrow on the playground because you stole their cookies, right? And so is there a social enterprise model that like actually exists, right? And what a social entrepreneur would do is like, they'd look around and they'd see an unequal distribution of cookies. But even in those undistribution of cookies, like maybe one kid's got 5 chocolate chips, but there's one kid over here that's got like one like macadamia nut cookie, right? So what the social entrepreneur does is figure out like, okay, let's actually carve up that little macadamia nut cookie, give it a little bit to everybody so that everybody actually feels like they're contributing. And now when you look around the room, everybody's looking at each other being like, I'm going to play with you tomorrow, right? And I might even bring like more cookies to share. So I don't know if that does it, but that's my attempt.
I love that. I love that 5-year-old description. And usually we would close this out, but I want to come back to something you mentioned before, that Florence Nightingale was the first, one of the first social entrepreneurs. And that is fascinating to me. So I want to ask you, why is Florence Nightingale one of the first social entrepreneurs? How was she a social entrepreneur?
We have we have a blog post called the 600-year history of the social enterprise movement and why the next 6 years are the most important. And Florence did a couple things really important. So first, she actually spent time on kind of the Eastern Front, and now of course I'm blanking on the war in Turkey, where she realized that actually like started to use like early forms of like data to track why why soldiers were dying in hospitals, right? And so she was one of the first proponents of like hygiene settings in hospitals. And then when she came back, right, when she came back to the UK and started to do work, she did a lot more kind of work like advocating that, and then advocating training, and then actually showing that there was a business model for nurses, right, which previously was voluntary, right? But to actually say, if we have more nurses, we can care for more people. They can take care of care, and we can scale the medical profession because we don't need doctors to solve everything, right? So she found a market inefficiency, very expensive doctors who actually were often making a lot of mistakes, finding a easier scalable intervention, and then finding funding in order to do that. And she was looking at it not just from one business model, but from a stakeholder approach, because she had to get doctors to approve of nurses. She had to get government to fund. She had to find philanthropy and even medical institutions to start hiring. So there was a lot of working that she did, but it was a very much like, if you think about everything that went into kind of getting the nursing profession to help scale the medical profession, that to me like is very representative of social enterprise thinking.
What a great story, and what a great note to end on, because it just proves, Mark, how much you've thought about this and how much leadership you have in this, and thinking about how we're not starting something new. It's something that's been happening for hundreds of years and potentially millennia. Maybe we have better vocabulary for it. But we're not starting something new. We're contributing to this really important movement. And thank you so much for the work that MovingWorlds does. It's really clearly very important. We're preparing the human capital for this extremely important movement and change in our world. So thank you so much for that work. And thank you for talking to us today.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to chat. This is a fun conversation. And also thanks to you and the Centrico team for helping us kind of get the word out about our work and support. We're definitely grateful for this opportunity and in general, just our partnership. Really my pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you for watching this episode of BCentrico in Conversation. If you're looking for more ways to tell your sustainability story, reach out. BCentrico is a managed marketing services company, and we help nonprofits and other purpose-driven companies to scale their impact. Our contact information is in the description below. I'd love to hear from you. And make sure you stay tuned for more conversations about sustainability and storytelling.